Hello, and I hope everyone is doing well. This is the Small Entrepreneur and Economic Development Legal Clinic at the University of Akron, and today we have material regarding employee versus independent contractors. So before we get started with today's materials, just a quick disclaimer that the materials were created by students under the supervision of a licensed attorney here at the University of Akron. These community resources were designed to educate and inform entrepreneurs in early stage startup businesses. So with that being said, these resources may omit terms and or language relevant to specific situations and circumstances. Although the Seed Clinic takes reasonable efforts to update its resources and provide current information, this PowerPoint, any of the templates provided are not legal advice and are not guaranteed to be complete or current. Any use of such material does not create an attorney-client relationship between its users and the Seed Clinic, nor does it constitute any legal advice or other professional advice. It is highly recommended to consult with a separate licensed attorney before using any of these forms, and further, the user of these forms and resources assume all risk and liability that may result from their use. In order to identify the differences between an employee and an independent contractor, we must first identify what is an employee and what is an independent contractor. An employee is a worker that is hired by a person or company, known as an employer, that regularly works for the company in exchange for an income. Regularly here is going to mean that it is consistent and or long-term, as opposed to short-term or project-specific work. Also, the income is going to be in the form of hourly wages or a salary. An employee is also likely eligible for benefits such as health insurance, paid time off, disability, workers' compensation, and so forth. And finally, the employer typically pays income taxes on behalf of an employee. So in comparison to an employee, we have an independent contractor. An independent contractor, similarly to an employee, is a worker that is hired by an employer. However, the terms of employment for an independent contractor are usually short-term and or project-specific. Further, the independent contractor and employer typically enter into an agreement in which it is well defined that the worker is in fact an independent contractor. Some things that are typically going to be within this agreement are going to be the terms of payment. So for an independent contractor, they are typically paid by the completion of a task or project as opposed to an hourly wage or salary. Further, they're not going to be entitled to any employee benefits, and they are typically responsible for providing the necessary equipment needed to complete the job. So for example, if a photographer is hired to take pictures of an event, they are typically going to be responsible for furnishing their own camera in order to take the pictures to complete the job. Now finally, an independent contractor is typically responsible for paying their own income taxes, meaning the employer will not withhold on their behalf. So you may be wondering, why is it important to discern between an employee and an independent contractor? Employers typically prefer to use independent contractors when they can because they are typically less expensive than an employee. An independent contractor, as I said earlier, is going to provide normally their own equipment to complete the job. They're not going to be withholding any taxes for an independent contractor. There's no training normally involved as they are hired because they are specialized in what they do. They do not have to award benefits to the independent contractor, nor do they have to provide any insurance to the independent contractor. Over time, an issue will arise where an employer will initially hire a worker as an independent contractor, but then rely on them more as an employee without giving that worker any employee treatment. So it begs the question, how are you able to tell the distinction? When considering whether a worker is an independent contractor or an employee, the courts are most concerned with who has more control over the work situation. The test is dependent on the particular facts of each scenario, but it is centered around the right to control the manner or means of performing the work. In other words, the court is going to look at whether the worker had more control over the work situation or whether the employer had more control over the work situation. If it is found that the worker had more control, it is likely that they will be treated as an independent contractor. Whereas if the employer is found to have more control, it is likely the worker will be treated as an employee. Now on the screen are some factors that the courts consider when making the determination between independent contractor and an employee, but it is important to note that this is not a complete list. and that no one factor is dispositive of determining whether a worker is an employee or an independent contractor. So starting with who controls the details and quality of the work, we will start, for example, with a fitness instructor. Now, if the fitness instructor is hired by the gym, and the gym tells the fitness instructor that you must complete the classes in this exact manner and lists a bunch of details in which the worker must comply with, it is likely that they will be found as an employee. Whereas if the fitness instructor has free reign to complete the classes they see fit, then it is likely that they will be treated as an independent contractor. Looking at who controls the hours worked, if the worker has the freedom to pick and choose their hours and come in as they please, that is more in line with the independent contractor. Whereas if the employer is telling the worker that they must show up during these hours or complete X amount of hours per week, that is more so in line with an employee. Looking at who selects the materials, tools, and equipment used, if the worker is furnishing their own equipment, their own tools, and getting no help from the employer to complete the job, then that is more so in line with the independent contractor. Whereas if the employer is providing everything to the worker, it is more likely to be found that there is an employee relationship there. Looking at the length of an employment, again, we're going to be looking at independent contractors on a short-term, project-specific basis, whereas employees are going to be long-term, more regular, more consistent. And then finally, how the worker is paid. An employee is more so in line with the hourly wages and salary previously discussed, and an independent contractor is more so by the completion of the project or the short-term timeline. So now that we know what the courts look to determine whether a worker is an employee or an independent contractor, I thought we could go through a couple of examples to test our understanding and ensure that we know the differences between an employee and an independent contractor. So starting off, we have a dance instructor who selects their own dance routines to teach, locates and rents their own facilities, provide their own sound systems, music and clothing, collects fees from customers, and are free to hire assistants. What do you guys think? Is this an employee or independent contractor? So if you answered independent contractor, you would be correct. Now we will go back to the fact pattern and break down where the factors fit into each fact provided. A dance instructor who selects their own dance routines to teach. This would go to the details and quality of the work as they are picking the routines that they want to teach, which would go into the details of the work. Locates and rents their own facilities would go to the materials, tools, and personnel used. Facility is a space that they are providing for themselves, so that would be more in line with the independent contractor. Provides their own sound systems. Again, the materials, tools, and personnel used. Probably the tools in this situation because a sound system could be considered a tool. Music and clothing. This would go to the details and quality of the work. Collects fees from customers. This would go to how the worker is paid. And that the dance instructor is free to hire assistants. This would go to the materials, tools, and personnel used. The personnel in the situation would be the assistant, which they have free reign to hire. So, to recap, this is an independent contractor, not an employee. So our next example is a dance instructor that works in a health club where the club sets the hours of work, the routines to be taught, and pays the instructors from fees collected by the club. Would this be an employee or independent contractor? If you said employee, you would be correct. Looking at the facts, we have a dance instructor that works in a health club where the club sets the hours of work. Now, looking at the fact that the dance instructor works in a health club, this may be construed as the worker is being provided a space to complete the work, namely by the employer, which would favor an employee treatment. Looking at the hours of work, the club is the one that sets the hours of work, meaning the dance instructor must work during certain times, which would lead again towards an employee treatment. They also control the routines to be taught, meaning the dance instructor does not have a say in what they can instruct on. So again, this would be in favor of an employee treatment. And finally, the club pays the instructors from fees collected by the club, which is more in line, again, with employee treatment. So for our final example, we have a dance instructor who selects their own dance routines, but performs the work at a club with equipment owned by the club, and is paid for every 3 classes taught. Would this be an employee or an independent contractor? Now this example is far less clear in determining whether the worker is an independent contractor or an employee. So looking at the fact pattern, we have a dance instructor who selects their own dance routines. This is regarding the factor of the details and quality of the work, and because the dance instructor is selecting their own dance routines, it is likely that this factor sways more in favor of an independent contractor. The next fact we have is that the dance instructor performs the work at a club with equipment owned by the club. Now, this may appear more to be in line with the employer-employee status, but with more fact-finding would probably be needed to determine how much of the equipment is being used, to what extent is it being used, and so on and so forth. And then finally, we have the dance instructor is paid for every 3 classes taught. Now, this fact alone is probably more indicative of an independent contractor agreement, but if the 3 classes taught was more continuous or more expected or more regular, then it would be more in line with an employee. But again, just the fact that they are paid for every 3 classes taught, they don't have to be consecutive, there's no other requirements, it's just 3 classes in order to be paid, it is likely that is going to favor an independent contractor status. So again, the answer very likely depends on the other facts surrounding the case, but you can make an argument for either side. So we have definitely covered a lot today in regard to employees and independent contractors, defining both, understanding the differences between them, why is it important, what test did the courts use in determining whether a worker is an independent contractor, an employee, and of course some examples that illustrate those differences. The C Clinic has also provided an independent contractor template that is an agreement, and a couple of notes about that is that the highlighted areas is intended to insert specific information that is relevant to the specific circumstances that you are dealing with. And then finally, any specific advice or questions should be sought out by individual counsel, as the C Clinic does not intend to form any lawyer-client relationship nor provide legal advice to the user. We hope you have found this information useful, and we thank you for tuning in.